Good evening. I'm Faith Goldie in for Michael Koren. Tonight's Faith Factor put an end to the propaganda on Ukraine. From Moscow to our own backyard, the current crisis in Ukraine is being seen through a haze of propaganda. This week, the Russian ambassador to Canada was asked to speak at the Empire Club. The topic? Russia, Ukraine, and Crimea. The Russian perspective. And before we dissect the ambassador's fantastical account of Ukraine's history and present situation, allow me to turn your attention to two glaring problems off the top. First, am I the only one struck by the fact that Ambassador Mammadov is, well, still within our borders? See, his nation's aggressive posturing along the eastern border of a sovereign nation, namely Ukraine, includes 80,000 soldiers, 270 tanks, 140 military aircrafts, and 19 warships. This after breaking its 1994 commitment to the Budapest Memorandum to secure the territorial integrity of Ukraine after she nixed her nukes. Further, the nation from where this ambassador hails, well, it's been effectively turfed from the Group of Eight, while Canada's RSVP'd no to the Sochi and Arctic Council summits. You'll forgive me if I don't buy the argument that, well, we're just trying to keep diplomatic lines open. We've already severed too many, and for very good reasons. Why we haven't sent Moscow's guy back to the belligerent nation that sent him is a really big question. Alas, well, he's still here, and Empire Club thought it would be good and well to have him speak, which brings me to the second puzzling point. There was no organized scrum with the ambassador. That's right. The event organizers found no problem with providing no opportunity for media to properly ask the Russian ambassador questions about, I don't know, how our own delegation in Moscow was given the boot on Tuesday, told they've got 14 days to pack up and get out. A claim, by the way, reported by Reuters, confirmed by the ministry, but wholly dismissed and denied by the ambassador himself.
I said that the report is rubbish, that Canadian ambassador was expelled from Moscow.
So it did not happen?
No, it didn't.
Media, myself included, as you can see, were forced to chase the Russian henchman down the halls where he avoided and evaded our every question. I don't claim to empathize with media folk in an oppressive regime, such as Russia. You know, that country where just this week the leader of the pro-Kremlin Nationalist Party told his aides to, quote, violently rape a reporter from state-funded Russia Today. He did so between mocking chants of Christ is risen. Oh, and did I mention she's quite obviously pregnant? Now, my interaction with the ambassador was not nearly as comparable in gravity to the situation I just described, but I couldn't help but wonder, where the hell am I? How is it that this man, a puppet of a regime in violation of innumerable international conventions, who has just spewed out strings of barefaced lies to national TV cameras, is allowed to do so without a time allotted for questions from the media of the country that hosts him? You would think an event organized by a Canadian group formed, by the way, at the turn of the last century would have a better grasp of Canadian values, such as transparency and free press. Rather, they, former Governor General Adrian Clarkson included, by the way, they bent as reeds to the Kremlin's minion, as though we were situated in some satellite state of the former Soviet Union. And that's the problem. See, if Russian propaganda is left unchallenged, even on our own soil, it allows for misinformation to have a monopoly on the microphone, and we then might lose sight of what's true. So why don't we just air out all this dirty laundry and separate the ambassador's fact from fiction right here? Russians admit they are massed along the eastern Ukrainian border, and following NATO's release of these satellite images, we know this to be true. But don't worry, Mammadov, well, he pinky promises nothing bad will happen.
Of course we're concerned because Ukraine is on the brink of civil war. Will we use them? I can give you my personal assurances. Our border troops won't cross Ukrainian border.
I feel better. Putin now claims that Russia has not crossed into Ukrainian territory and won't do so unless fired upon. Odd, because just last week, Putin admitted for the first time that the troops in unmarked uniforms who took over Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, well, that they were in fact Russian soldiers. Never mind that the news was reported across every major international media outlet and the National Post, too, which sponsored Tuesday's event with the ambassador. See, Mammadov, he says it's us, Canadians, who are propagating the lies.
Putin has admitted the fact that Russian troops helped to take over Crimea. How are we to
believe...
He didn't, honey, he didn't.
He
didn't, honey.
Honey,
he didn't.
Pardon me.
Thank you for coming.
My name is not Honey. How are we to believe that Russian troops are not currently in Donetsk,
Relax,
in Luhansk?
Relax, lady, relax.
How are we to believe that they're not Russian troops?
Take a deep breath.
They are Russian
and
issues.
relax.
So the Russian Black Sea
Relax. You know, I am not a psychiatrist.
Really? Are we to believe that the so-called green men taking over government and police buildings in over 12 towns and cities across Ukraine's eastern border just stumbled across standard Russian military-issued high-power rifles, grenade launchers, fatigues, and body armor? Even the U.S. State Department agrees Russian special forces are engaged in covert actions in Ukraine. Never mind the U.S. paper-thin so-called solution towards de-escalation in the recent Geneva Agreement, which accomplished absolutely nothing, or smiling Biden's mission to Kyiv, for that matter, which, again, amounted to zilch. And you'll forgive me if U.S. troops to nations that aren't Ukraine isn't exactly my idea of a solution, okay, but I'm digressing right now. The ambassador is lying when he says it's not his guys in eastern Ukraine, and we know it, even if we are doing nothing about it. Further, Russian leaders and the Russian press have insisted Ukrainian protesters were extremists and that their victory was a coup. And Ambassador Mammadov, well, he distinctly used the term coup in Toronto. Let's be very clear. The events which began in the Maidan are a classic popular revolution. Has it ever before happened that people associated with Ukrainian, Russian, Belarusian, Armenian, Polish, and Jewish culture have died in a revolution that was all started by a Muslim? Can we, who pride ourselves in our diverse and tolerant Western democracy, think of anything even remotely similar in our own histories? Even still, Ukraine's President Viktor Yanukovych used the same cliches after his public visit with Putin. Speaking of Viktor, by the way, the Russian ambassador to Canada, well, he insists Yanuk is, even after all that's happened, the rightful head of the Ukrainian government.
And that's why, by the way, right now, whether you like it or not, there's only one legitimate president in Ukraine, according to Ukrainian constitution, Mr. Yanukovych. He was shot on. He had to run for his life.
Oh, please. Sure, Yanukovych came to power through democratic elections, but then he altered the system from within. For example, the leader had been a common criminal, a rapist, and a thief. He found a judge who was willing to misplace documents related to his case. That judge, well, then he became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. What do you know? There were no constitutional objections subsequently when the leader asserted ever more power for his presidency. More still, the oligarch-in-chief, well, his son, a dentist, was suddenly one of the wealthiest men in Europe. Tens of billions of dollars simply disappeared from the state budget. And Yanukovych went on to build for himself a series of extravagant homes, perhaps, by the way, the ugliest in architectural history. Yanuk stole from the people at a time when the state was going bankrupt. His power was diminished until he was finally overthrown by a revolutionary force composed of his own statespeople, who were fired upon, some 100 killed by their own special force at Yanuk's command. Yanukovych is not a victim, as Russian delegates would have you believe, but a criminal. And as a final nail in the coffin, the Russian ambassador had the audacity to make this claim.
My country lost 30 million lives, population approximately of Canada, to fight fascism.
Right. Ukraine and Russia, partners in the fight against fascism. Never mind the 10 million Ukrainians starved to death by Moscow in the Holodomor of the 1930s. Now, Russian leaders are evoking old Tsarist terminology of Novorossiya, albeit it's helping Putin in the polls. He's at 80% approval rating. This in tandem with talks of what rightfully belongs to Russia. Now, if we started redrawing the map based on old historical questions of right, Alaska, well, go back to Russia, Texas, California, and Florida to Mexico, Poland back to its former borders, which would include Western Ukraine, and, well, look at this. Parts of Russia east of Kharkiv, well, they would be handed back to, wait for it, Ukraine. What Putin and his hired guns are insisting upon breaks the basis of international relations. That is, the sanctity of national borders, tearing up the basis of how the world has worked since at least World War II, I would argue 1648. Unlike what the Russian ambassador would have you believe, Russia is not a friendly big brother to nations like Ukraine. It is a government that propagates lies, breaks promises enshrined in law, and provides safe harbor to rapists and thieves. And yet, Canada, well, we offer its personnel a place to stay and spew its propaganda without challenge.
We have advocated for a firm response to Russia's involvement and intimidation in Ukraine, but I think we have a moral responsibility to stand, particularly with our NATO allies.
That was Foreign Affairs Minister John Baird. Will Canada stand on guard for Ukraine? Joining me now is Mark Schweck, former president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Thank you very much for joining me today, Mark. Right off the top, let's get caught up with the most recent events going on in Ukraine. The situation is getting more serious as the days go on. 13 people missing, politician dead, signs of torture. Walk me through what we know has happened and what we think has happened.
Well, we know right now that Russia is trying to recreate what happened in Crimea. So they're coming in trying to bribe people. That's not working everywhere. They've managed to bribe some. They're coming in coercing people, trying to threaten them. That's working in some cases, but not everywhere. When both of those don't work, what they're doing is now resorting to kidnapping people. And when they're kidnapped and they don't break, they're obviously trying to kill them now. To send a message to everyone else, either you come with us or don't go out at all on the street. Don't be in power. Don't be a politician. Don't be a police officer. Don't be a journalist out there.
Now, I know within Crimea we saw a massive exodus of Ukrainian Catholic priests and the like because they were afraid of kidnapping. Now we were actually seeing kidnapping taking place. You talk about the Russian government trying to send a message. Talk to me about this politician who was tortured. What kind of message was sent there? What did we see as marks of evidence of torture that led to his death?
Well, first of all, he's a member of the Batyushchina party, which is the party that's kind of ruling the government in Kyiv. They're at the top of the pinnacle right now. So they want to send a clear message to them that you must get out of eastern Ukraine. They clearly tortured this man. He had signs of being beaten. They cut a knife mark, a wound across his chest and stomach, filled a backpack with sand, wrapped it around him, threw him in the river while he was still alive. So they clearly want to intimidate people. They did the same with Bulatov, the guy who ran the Automaidan, the cars that were demonstrating in Kyiv. They tortured him and crucified him next to Kyiv and then dumped him in the woods, and he made it back to the city. So they clearly want to send the same kind of message that Yanukovych did in Kyiv.
Mark, you're talking of crucifixions in a Western, what should be a democracy, often functioning as an oligarchy. Why isn't this getting coverage? Are we truly in a haze of propaganda here in even the Western world?
Sure. Well, Moscow has a huge machine. Putin is investing millions of dollars per day to keep his military machine going and his propaganda machine going. And they are trying to dominate the headlines with the message that he wants to put out there. It's not that people are not reporting it. It's just not getting picked up here just because of the sheer weight of the number of press releases and sheer media power that Putin has at his disposal. We're fighting regular civilians, and regular people are fighting against a monster machine.
So are we to believe then in cities like Luhansk, Slavyansk, Donetsk, that the government and police buildings that have been seized there are in fact by folks that are in no way associated with Russian military or the rest of it, or should we be questioning this?
So a couple things. One is, for sure, there's Russian military. There's at least one clip where it shows in one of the cities where the Russian lieutenant colonel took over the police force and told the boys, this is the way it works, I'm in charge. And they lined up behind him. So clearly he's in charge, and he's been identified as Russian special forces. So clearly that's one clear piece of evidence. Second is they all have modern weaponry. They all have the same weaponry. They all have modern outfits, are outfitted, and they seem to be getting around and communicating very clear as if they are military people.
And some of the photographs that are emerging now, we see guys in places like Slavyansk who were photographed all the way yonder in Crimea and were photographed even back to 2008 in Georgia, which brings me to the question. So things are getting worse by the day, I would say, not even by the month anymore. Canada we've sent over our CF-18s to, NATO allies that are not in Ukraine. We've sanctioned the heck out of Russian oligarchs and the rest of it. Is our response appropriate, or do we need to see more?
Well, Canada's been good, but we need to see more from the West. If everybody acted like Canada, they'd do very well. We need more sanctions. We need deeper sanctions against more people. The whole Russian government who supports Putin, without a debate on invading Crimea. We need to have deeper sanctions in terms of the level of sanctions, preventing people from traveling to Europe. Really let it hurt all of them. Second thing is we need to have military assistance to Ukraine, whether it's boots on the ground or whether it's military aid hardware to help the Ukrainian government. The military in Ukraine has been stripped by Yanukovych over the last 5 years for sure. Prior to that, other groups have stripped them. They have taken apart the military piece by piece, leaving it vulnerable to Russian attack.
And not to mention the fact that Russia's got 15 times the national defense budget. We're going to have to leave it there. Mark, thank you so much for your input today.
My pleasure.